Welcome back to Haunted and Historic Australia for another episode of Criminals, Cutthroats and Convicts. In this episode, we follow the story of murderous Mad Tom and the sighting of a white beast. At the time of the events, Martin Brennan was the Senior Superintendent of Police, and he was stationed in the Queanbeyan district. Lucky for us, Martin Brennan, in his older age, had the wisdom to write down this particular story, amongst others, in a book he published called Australian Reminiscences. And it was basically a book compiled of all the adventures that he had as a police superintendent. Martin Brennan was born in September of 1839 in County Kilkenny of Ireland. He migrated to New South Wales at age 20 in 1859 and joined the Mounted Patrol in Braidwood. He ran the Gold Escort to Goulburn for 2 years, meaning that after a lot of these Cobb & Co coaches that were carrying mail and things like that were being robbed by the bushrangers, so they needed an escort, a police escort, to ensure that the mail and whatever else goodies were being carried in the Cobb & Co coaches, or what other coaches were being used, weren't always held up and the goods taken. It was at this time that there's a story about him being wounded in the arm and had 4 horses shot under him. In 1862, Brennan became a senior constable at Maruya, and on the 4th of July 1865, he married Elizabeth McKeon from Galway. He was one of the first policemen who, in conjunction with the first people, were able to track people using their techniques successfully. He was transferred to Araluen and from 1872 was in charge of the Queanbeyan station. And this is where the events take place. It was the 28th of June, 1876. Martin Brennan was called to the boundary of Queanbeyan and Yass police districts to a crime scene where a shepherd named Jeremiah McCarthy had been murdered. This tragic murder of poor Jeremiah McCarthy was on a remote area, very isolated on the banks of Murrumbidgee River, a few kilometres from the present town of Murrumbateman. Steep hills surrounded this area on 3 of its sides, so there's really nowhere for the poor man to have run to. The nearest homestead was at Yumbara, a couple of kilometres away. So had he screamed, nobody would have heard him. Jeremiah was working for a man named James Ramsey, who was stationed at Nanama, which was also quite a ways away from him. James Ramsey confirmed that the body was Jeremiah McCarthy. He was a 45-year-old man, single, sober and well-read in quite a lot of religious books. James Ramsey was very upset, as Jeremiah was quite a lovely man. Didn't hurt anybody, didn't have fights with anyone, didn't really go anywhere but on the station and looking after the sheep. And it was hard to find good shepherds who would live in such remote locations. When Senior Sergeant Brennan arrived with one of his troopers, he was met with an inspector and another trooper from Yass. It was worked out pretty quickly from the state of poor Jeremiah's body that it was willful murder. He'd been shot in the head, and the front half of his skull had been sort of hacked away with a sharp implement. 32 pieces of lead shot were removed from what was left of his brain. Whoever killed him really wanted him dead. Who would do such a thing? The body was quickly wrapped in some blankets that were found nearby. Senior Sergeant Brennan went inside the shepherd's hut, and the place was in disarray. Many of Jeremiah's books had been thrown around the hut. It was like someone had ransacked the place looking for something. But what could a lonely shepherd have? I'm sure he wasn't on massive amounts of money. But it did appear that there were some animals living inside the hut. There was a goanna that was sitting in a meat bag, which would have been Jeremiah's meat possibly for the week, and the animal was now sleeping inside that meat bag after having filled its belly. Another animal they located was in his fireplace. Possums had made a home in there. It didn't sound like the incident had just happened. In June, in Australia, it's winter, and it would have been frightfully cold down near Canberra. And for possums to be staying in his fireplace meant that it hadn't been used. It must have been a couple of days that his poor body was lying in the field before James Ramsey raised the alarm. Just as with the case of Looney McDougall in our previous episode, he also had been a shepherd. And as you can tell, it seems as though they were targeted, much like the Cobb & Co coach. They also noticed inside the hut that flour and sugar had been tampered with. There was also a tin of strychnine close by to where the flour and the sugar was. It appeared that the poison had been possibly put into the flour and sugar, but they'd have to find this out by testing it. Something had really gone on in this hut. There was also clear boot marks on the dirt floor. One pair looked as though it was McCarthy, and another, much larger, of a person wearing boots, but of 2 left feet. Someone with 2 left feet? That seems really odd. So they buried the body close to the hut. They had to find out who murdered poor Jeremiah McCarthy and close this case. So they went around to the closest homestead, which was Queanbeyan, where Charles Hall gave them little information. He mustn't have heard anything being so far away. Another station they went to, at Ginninderra, a William Davis had some interesting news. William Davis said that only a little time ago, a shady character known to the area, Mad Tom the Soldier, had called in. Mad Tom was about 60 years old. He was tall and looked pretty strong. He only had one eye that he stated to everybody was lost in the Battle of Waterloo. But it was very confirmed that he never went to the Battle of Waterloo, and that the story went that he tried to kidnap a child from the First People, and one of them had attacked him, poking his eye out with a spear. He had a grizzly beard and lank hair and a quite battered face. He wasn't a treat to look at all. He had roamed the Murrumbidgee region for years, begging, stealing and intimidating people with his 6-foot-long barreled rifle and a bayonet-like knife. Police suspected him of some crimes in the past, but without a whole heap of evidence were not able to convict him. So he roamed around doing as he pleased. William Davis also mentions that Mad Tom had asked him if McCarthy was still at Walshpool. Now that was a nail in the coffin for Mad Tom. Not only did William Davis catch him rooting around in his kitchen area, he also noticed after he left that a couple of his items were missing, which included a couple of blankets, a left boot, and a tin of strychnine. The police knew Mad Tom was behind it, and they set out to apprehend him. It wasn't long before Senior Sergeant Brennan had Mad Tom the Soldier tracked down. There was a bit of a gunfight that took place trying to apprehend him. He was able to get one shot from his murderous gun before being overpowered and taken into custody. He was wearing 2 left boots. The police had their man, and they weren't going to let him get away this time. He was taken to Queanbeyan jail that evening. They decided for more evidence they would have to exhume the body of poor Jeremiah McCarthy and check that the blankets that he was buried with were the blankets that Mad Tom had stolen from William Davis. They already had the strychnine, but because he was shot, they had to be sure, although 2 left boots was pretty convincing, I believe. So as it was, Senior Sergeant Brennan and the inspector from Yass with 2 other troopers, returned to where poor Jeremiah was buried to carry out the task of exhuming the body. Now, this is where things get a bit strange. I'll read what Senior Superintendent Martin Brennan says of this afternoon and the strange events that would haunt him for the rest of his days. It was a beautiful, clear day. Everything seemed still in the locality, save the she-oaks which abounded along the banks of the then low and placid river, which gave out doleful murmurs to the slightest zephyr. The sun rays shone along the serpentine windings of the river, but this was changed in a brief space, and scarcely had we stood beside the grave when a large cloud came upon us, enveloped the mountains, and washable in comparative darkness. We commenced the work of exhumation, and just as the spade had touched the timber slab which rested on the body, the sound of a terrific explosion took place. The ground trembled and seemed to sink beneath our feet, as if from the impact of a monster thunderbolt, or aerolite hurled by Jupiter, father of gods and men, against our planet, and rumbling sound of a great volume reverberated through the valley for some seconds. Before we had recovered ourselves, however, from this appalling experience, a roar was heard on the mountain top above us, which was intensified by repetitions along the valley of the great river, when suddenly we observed through the gloom a huge bull of immaculate whiteness rushing down the declivity towards us. We promptly sought the protection of the trees close by, drew revolvers, and stood in readiness for defence. But this was unnecessary, as the animal, on reaching the open grave, stopped suddenly, and with head erect surveyed the surroundings, pawed the earth for a few seconds, then lay beside the grave, moaned piteously, and expired. How strange! These were the words of a senior sergeant, superintendent of police, as well as 3 other police, and they all saw the same thing. Now, Brennan goes on to state that, assuring themselves that the animal was really dead, began to continue to exhumate the grave of Jeremiah McCarthy alongside this white bull's corpse. It was amazing. White, like an albino bull. He says that they didn't take long getting the body out then, and quickly made tracks. They didn't want to stick around. What a strange occurrence. But they managed to confirm that the blankets were of Mr. Davis, and that was all the evidence they needed to convict Mad Tom. He was done for. Mad Tom was sent for a trial before a judge who happened to be a real soldier, a retired lieutenant colonel with a soft spot for ex-servicemen. The prosecution pointed out that Tom was a liar, a thief and murderer, and hadn't been in the Battle of Waterloo. He hadn't even been born when the battle took place. He was a convict transported from England. However, the judge couldn't bring himself to send Mad Tom to the gallows. He probably felt pity on him, as he was quite mad, and probably wasn't sound of mind. Well, he wasn't. He gave him a prison sentence instead. Mad Tom would spend the rest of his days in prison, much to the confusion of the police, including Sergeant Brennan, who believed he should have been hung. This white beast that Martin Brennan had seen and that other troopers had witnessed, this white beast was still on Martin Brennan's mind. He couldn't shake it. The great beast was a marvellous symmetry and in perfect condition. Brennan couldn't understand how it could just die like that, right next to where Jeremiah McCarthy was buried. It was just all too strange. He couldn't leave the beast out there like that, and decided he was going to send one of his troopers to go and bury it. Now, the story of this white, amazing beast had possibly been spread around town by the cops who saw it. And William Davis was one such man, said he had a special interest in it and wanted to see the carcass for himself. So he rode along with the trooper to where the location was that Jeremiah was buried and where this white beast had last been seen dead. When they arrived at the shepherd's hut, everything was just as the police had left it 2 days earlier. But the bull had vanished. There was no drag marks where perhaps the first people may have dragged it away and eaten it. There was no carcass left behind that had been eaten away by the native animals. There was nothing, not even a mark where the beast had laid down dead. How strange. It was as if it never happened. But it had happened. They'd seen it. It wasn't a hot day where they could have been overcome by heat and hallucinated, all four. It was winter in Australia, which would have been cold, even in the daytime. There is no reason why they would make up this story, and, as we find out, it wasn't the only time this beast had been seen. It perplexed Martin Brennan. He went over the events in his mind over and over again. The large storm cloud, the earth moving, the loud thunder crack, the bull. They'd all seen it. Had they all gone mad at once? It didn't seem likely. They'd seen something that day, all of them. 4 men of high regard, policemen, had seen something. But what was it? And how could it have disappeared? He did what any other policeman would do and investigate it. It had been a hot year prior to winter. There had been a lot of drought. It was very dry, and there had been little vegetation for any animals to have survived out in that area, other than the sheep that Jeremiah had been looking after. But for stray animals, they just couldn't survive. It had been in perfect condition. It wasn't injured in any way. It was pure white, almost angelic. He decided it had to have been supernatural, and admitted this in his book. I am aware that those who allege to have seen ghosts, apparitions, and mysterious manifestations are looked upon as weak-minded and superstitious, but unable to account what 4 police officers in perfect health and with all their faculties unimpaired witnessed, I conclude it to have been a psychological phenomenon. Senior Superintendent Martin Brennan had many experiences in that life, but the white angelic beast was one that he couldn't shake. He couldn't get that beast from his mind, so long as he lived. There was actually some evidence that came to light after this case was closed and almost forgotten about. William Davis, so curious to see this white beast for himself. Later on it was known that he'd previously to this case had been at Mr. Charles Hall's property at Queanbeyan, and he'd been shooting with some friends, and he had come across the white beast before. William Davis, being an expert marksman, raised his rifle, fired once, and dropped the animal in its tracks. The bull died instantly a few metres from his feet. It is not known what he did with the body, or if it disappeared, but he'd definitely seen it before, and later, when he heard about the appearance of this ghostly white bull at the murder scene, he wanted to be sure if it was the same animal, or perhaps one like it. Maybe there was a herd of them, and was probably not surprised when he went with the trooper and found that the body had gone. Another story came out a little bit later, after the book was published, possibly upon reading the story. A descendant of Mr. Charles Hall, who owned the property Queanbeyan, asked an elderly aunt of his about this ghostly bull. His aunt told him that there was no doubt about the bull's existence, as she had seen it herself. The aunt went on to say, "Oh, I've seen it a few times. Yes, it comes back every time one of the family dies. I remember it suddenly appeared on a ridge near the homestead at sunset one evening during the last war," which possibly was World War II. "There was a brilliant pink sunset, and at first it was just a big dark silhouette against the sky. The thing stood still for maybe a couple of minutes as we watched it. It raised its head, shook its horns, and let out a tremendous roar that echoed around the valley. It turned, and the light caught its hide, and for a moment it shone white. Then it was gone. But the strange thing was, the next day we found out an uncle, he was a soldier fighting in the Middle East somewhere, had been killed in battle." She mentioned it so casually, as if seeing a ghostly white bull was not that much to talk about. And then there was Mad Tom, rotting away for the rest of his days in a prison cell, and they say he was delirious in the end, crying out that he was being trampled inside the cell by a large, invisible white bull. The area at the moment is still quite vast and uninhabited. It may be that the white bull still roams. Perhaps anyone who dies in that area of Queanbeyan, the bull appears, possibly as a spirit animal for the person who leaves this earth. It's so fascinating and amazing. We hope you enjoyed this story. I much prefer these supernatural stories over the murderous ones myself. Stay tuned because we've got plenty more to tell and a couple more adventures on the way as well. But don't forget to like, subscribe and share and comment what kind of stories you enjoy. What are your favourites? Till next time.